Hi everybody. Just to introduce myself, because I'm probably a bit of a new face to the room. I'm Francesco Naismith, and I work at the AER, leading a new external affairs team at the AER, which is primarily responsible for government relations and supporting stakeholder engagement by the board, the AER board. And so part of our work is to coordinate our input with the Energy Security Board and other policy development and stakeholder or advocacy opportunities. So the NEM data strategy is something that was recommended by the Finkel blueprint a couple of years ago, and basically the objective was to enhance availability of data and information to support the market to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. And the AER was nominated as the market body to support the ESB in doing this work. The timing of the Finkel recommendations was it sort of came at a time when there was almost some sort of kind of collective policy awakening to data issues in Australia across the board. It coincided with the Productivity Commission's Data Availability and Use Report, which sort of started the two prongs of the CDR and also the data sharing and release policy development, which is happening out of PM&C. So I think that, reflecting on Louise's comments from yesterday morning, the gravity and impact of that report will be only realised more and more over time, and I would agree with that assessment. So we've talked a lot about, or heard a lot about, the consumer data right and the implications that it will have for the market, particularly consumers and retailers. But what has only come up a little bit, I think, in the last 2 days has been the data sharing and release legislation, which aims to basically streamline the process for sharing public sector data and improve data safeguards across the public service. So that piece of policy will have quite significant implications for agencies like the AER, other Commonwealth agencies such as the Department, the ACCC, and interestingly will also, as it currently stands, or as I currently understand it, apply to Snowy Hydro, Red Energy and Lumo Energy. So watching the interface in those organisations between how they reconcile the DSNR bill and the CDR obligations might be an interesting sort of space to watch, and something that we should keep abreast of. So in terms of developing an NEM-wide data strategy, we kind of need to watch this space in a lot of ways to fully understand and appreciate how the current policy development and what the current policy development will mean for the sector before basically proceeding with more policy development. Because at the end of the day, we need to make sure that there is alignment of regulatory frameworks, because compliance costs are ultimately borne by the consumer. So if we create conflicting or inconsistent policy frameworks, this is going to create a regulatory burden and will be difficult both for the regulator and those entities that it applies for, and become a costly exercise. So some of the things that I've picked up sort of in the last 2 days, which to reflect on the sessions that we've sort of been part of, or that we've heard about. I think that moving forward, we need to make sure that we have specific regard to privacy and safety of data subjects, and also be hyper vigilant that no consumers are left behind in any policy initiatives or any benefits that we see coming out of data policy. And a good way to proceed from here will be to basically work towards undertaking a gap analysis, and particularly from a policy setting, to identify regulatory barriers to access and also barriers to sharing data across the board. One interesting point that you might like to know is, for instance, the Commonwealth Department of Energy is not an authorised recipient of data from the AER under the Competition and Consumer Act or regulations. So every time the AER wants to share data with the Commonwealth Department, we have to go through an approval process which requires a level of seniority that we would probably not otherwise have to do. So there's little bits here and there such as that which we deal with, but does create sort of problems and day-to-day issues. So a couple of things that people have said that have sort of stuck with me, or I sort of noted down. yesterday Michael talked about how not defining complete data sets at the beginning of his work led to what he called an endless game of whack-a-mole. And this morning Adam talked about how if you make decisions in the dark, you're likely to make bad decisions. So to reiterate also Rosemary's comments this morning, we should really focus on the fact that right now we're working to establish the foundations of policy settings and overarching frameworks that are quite likely to govern data rights for well into the future. So we need to work towards strong consensus in terms of the principles that we want to use for our approaches, but we also need to retain a good degree of regulatory flexibility to allow us not only to respond to challenges, but also, and I think probably more importantly, leverage opportunities as they arise, because I think that we should also, someone, I forget who it was, apologies, yesterday talked about having a positive sort of approach and spin on a lot of this, and I think that that's a really good sort of piece of advice or thought, is that we should look at this as there are going to be lots of opportunities well into the future, and we want to be able to take those up. Because basically, in my experience anyway, public policy, it's very difficult to wipe the slate clean and start again once you've got something in place. You tend to instead go through the arduous task of iterative reform over decades and centuries potentially. So what we need to do now is do the best that we can in the current circumstances, and so the CSIRO department and AEMO work is an amazing example of that, but not rush policy development, because we're likely to be stuck with what comes out at the other end for a very long time. Cheers. Thank you.